Have you ever wondered what happens when beauty masks pure evil, when privilege becomes a weapon of destruction? Today, I'm taking you to the darkest corners of Mississippi in 1844, where one woman's thirst for revenge would stain the bayous with blood for generations. If this story chills you to the bone, make sure to subscribe to our channel, share this video with someone brave enough to hear it, and comment below telling me where you're watching from, because this tale of Evelyn Beauregard will haunt your dreams tonight. My name is Evelyn Beauregard, and I suppose you've heard the whispers about me carried on the humid Mississippi wind. They call me the cruelest mistress who ever walked these cotton fields, the woman who castrated husbands and slaves alike. But let me tell you my story, the real story, before you judge me too harshly. It was the spring of 1844, when I first laid eyes on Beauregard Plantation. The magnolias were in full bloom, their white petals floating like ghosts across the manicured lawns. I was 22 then, with skin like porcelain and hair the color of midnight. Men said I was beautiful, but beauty in the South was just another commodity to be traded, like cotton or tobacco. My father, Colonel Thaddeus Whitmore, had arranged my marriage to Jeremiah Beauregard, a man twice my age, with hands stained by both soil and sin. The wedding was a grand affair. The entire county came to witness the union of two of Mississippi's most prominent families. I wore my grandmother's pearls and a dress of ivory silk that cost more than most people earned in a year. But beneath the celebration, I felt the cold grip of dread. Jeremiah's eyes held a darkness that made my skin crawl, and when he smiled, it never reached those pale blue orbs. During our wedding dance, his grip on my waist was possessive, painful. He whispered in my ear, "You belong to me now, little dove." Body and soul. The honeymoon was a nightmare I've tried to forget. Jeremiah was rough, violent, treating me like property he'd purchased rather than a wife he'd vowed to cherish. The bruises on my arms told stories I could never speak aloud, hidden beneath long sleeves and forced smiles when we entertained guests. For months I played the perfect Southern belle. I hosted tea parties for the plantation wives, supervised the house slaves with a gentle hand, and smiled prettily when Jeremiah's business associates came calling. But inside, a fire was building, a rage so pure and white-hot that it threatened to consume everything in its path. The plantation itself was a monument to wealth built on suffering. 300 slaves worked the cotton fields under the merciless Mississippi sun, their backs bent and spirits broken. The main house was a Greek revival masterpiece with towering columns and wraparound porches, but it felt more like a beautiful prison than a home. I spent my days walking the grounds, observing everything with the keen eye my father had taught me. He'd always said I had a mind for business, unusual for a woman, but useful nonetheless. I learned the names of every slave, every overseer, every inch of the property that would one day be mine. It was during one of these walks that I first noticed Jeremiah's wandering eye. He thought he was subtle, but I saw how he looked at Celeste, a young mulatto girl who worked in the kitchen. She couldn't have been more than 16, with skin like café au lait and eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. I said nothing at first. A proper wife was expected to turn a blind eye to her husband's indiscretions, especially when they involved the slaves. But every night, as Jeremiah forced himself upon me with increasing brutality, I thought about Celeste and felt something dark and terrible growing in my chest. The breaking point came on a sweltering August evening. I'd retired early with a headache but couldn't sleep in the oppressive heat. I decided to walk in the garden, hoping for a cool breeze from the river. That's when I heard them, soft moans and whispered endearments coming from the old carriage house. I crept closer, my bare feet silent on the dew-dampened grass. Through a crack in the wooden door, I saw them, my husband and Celeste, their bodies intertwined on a bed of hay. But it wasn't just the adultery that made my blood run cold. It was the tenderness in Jeremiah's touch, the gentle way he caressed her face. He'd never touched me like that, never looked at me with such desire and affection. I watched for what felt like hours, memorizing every detail, every whispered word of love. When they finished, Jeremiah kissed Celeste's forehead and promised to buy her freedom, to take her north where they could be together. My heart shattered and reformed into something harder, sharper, more dangerous. I returned to the house in silence, my mind already working, planning. I'd been raised to be a lady, but my father had also taught me that sometimes ladies had to be ruthless to survive. The The Whitmore family hadn't built their fortune by being weak or forgiving. The next morning, I played my part perfectly. I served Jeremiah his coffee with a smile, asked about his plans for the day, and kissed his cheek when he left to inspect the fields. But inside, I was calculating, preparing for what needed to be done. I spent the day gathering information, speaking quietly with the house slaves who trusted me. I learned that Jeremiah's affair with Celeste had been going on for months, that he'd promised her things he'd never promised me. I also learned about the old root cellar beneath the house, a place where previous generations had stored preserves and wine, but which had been abandoned for years. That evening, I prepared Jeremiah's favorite meal: roasted duck with sweet potatoes and bourbon sauce. I added a special ingredient to his wine, a sleeping draught I'd learned to make from my grandmother's old recipes. She'd used it for medicinal purposes, but I had something else in mind. As Jeremiah grew drowsy after dinner, I helped him to our bedroom, playing the concerned wife. "You've been working so hard, darling," I cooed, loosening his collar. "You need your rest." Within minutes, he was unconscious, snoring softly on our marriage bed. I looked down at him. This man who'd hurt me, humiliated me, planned to abandon me, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. The hardest part was moving his body. Jeremiah was a large man, and even with the help of 2 trusted house slaves who owed me their loyalty, it took hours to get him down to the root cellar. I prepared everything in advance: shackles bolted to the stone walls, candles for light, and a collection of tools I'd gathered from the plantation's blacksmith shop. When Jeremiah woke the next morning, he found himself chained in darkness, with only my voice for company. I sat just outside the circle of candlelight, my white dress making me look like an avenging angel. "Good morning, husband," I said sweetly. "I trust you slept well." His confusion quickly turned to rage, then fear as he realized his situation. He cursed me, threatened me, promised me riches if I'd release him, but I just smiled and began to speak, telling him exactly what I'd seen in the carriage house, exactly what I knew about his plans with Celeste. "You see, Jeremiah," I said, my voice never losing its gentle southern cadence, "I've learned that sometimes a wife must take matters into her own hands. You've broken our marriage vows, and now you must face the consequences." What happened next in that root cellar would become legend throughout Mississippi, whispered about in parlors and slave quarters alike. But that, my dear listeners, is a story for tomorrow. The darkness I unleashed that day would consume everything in its path, turning me from a wronged wife into something far more terrifying. Some say I became a monster. Others say I simply became what the South had always demanded of its women, strong enough to survive in a world that would destroy us. But one thing is certain: after that night in the root cellar, Evelyn Beauregard was never the same again. Welcome back to the darkest tale ever told from the Mississippi Delta. Yesterday we left Evelyn Beauregard standing over her chained husband in a forgotten root cellar, her heart turned to ice by betrayal. Today we witness the birth of a legend that would terrorize the South for generations. If you're new here, subscribe now, because this story only gets more intense. Share this with someone who loves dark history, and let me know in the comments if you're brave enough to hear what happened next. 3 days I kept Jeremiah in that cellar. 3 days of listening to his pleas turned to threats, then back to desperate bargaining. I brought him water and thin gruel, just enough to keep him alive while I prepared for what was to come. During those 3 days, I played the worried wife to perfection. I told the overseers that Jeremiah had ridden to Natchez on urgent business, that he'd be back within the week. I forged his handwriting on plantation orders, maintaining the illusion that everything was normal. The slaves whispered among themselves, but none dared question the mistress directly. On the 3rd night, I descended into the cellar carrying a leather satchel that had belonged to my grandfather, a surgeon during the War of 1812. Inside were instruments he'd used to save lives, scalpels, bone saws, and other tools of healing that I would now use for a very different purpose. Jeremiah's eyes widened when he saw the bag. "Evelyn, please," he whispered, his voice hoarse from screaming. "I'll end it with Celeste. I'll never touch another woman. Just let me go." I set the bag down carefully and lit more candles, filling the cellar with flickering light that danced across the stone walls like demons. "Oh, my dear husband," I said, my voice soft as silk. "It's far too late for promises now." I opened the satchel slowly, letting him see each instrument as I laid them out on a clean white cloth. The scalpel gleamed like silver lightning. The bonesaw's teeth caught the candlelight like a predator's grin. Jeremiah began to sob, great heaving sounds that echoed off the walls. "You see, Jeremiah, I've been thinking about justice," I continued, selecting a small, sharp knife. "About what the Bible says regarding adultery, about what a man truly values most." I moved closer to him, and he tried to shrink away, but the chains held him fast. His expensive clothes were now stained with sweat and fear, his proud bearing reduced to cowering terror. "Please, Evelyn, I'm begging you." "The way I begged you to be gentle on our wedding night," I interrupted, my voice still eerily calm. "The way I begged you to treat me with respect, the way I begged you not to humiliate me with that slave girl." I knelt beside him, the knife steady in my hand. "You took something from me, Jeremiah. My dignity, my trust, my ability to love. Now I'm going to take something from you." What followed was a symphony of screams that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house above. I worked with the precision my grandfather had taught me during my childhood visits to his medical practice. He'd always said I had steady hands and a strong stomach, qualities that served me well that night. When it was over, Jeremiah lay unconscious from pain and blood loss. I'd cauterized the wounds to prevent him from bleeding to death. I wasn't ready for him to die yet. I wanted him to live with the consequences of his betrayal, to remember every day what his infidelity had cost him. I cleaned my instruments carefully, washing away every trace of blood. Then I sat in the darkness beside my mutilated husband and waited for dawn. The next morning, I summoned Dr. Whitfield, the plantation's physician, claiming that Jeremiah had suffered a terrible accident while inspecting the mill machinery. The doctor was horrified by the injuries, but accepted my explanation. After all, who would suspect a delicate southern lady of such brutality? While Dr. Whitfield tended to Jeremiah, I dealt with Celeste. I found her in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast, unaware that her world was about to crumble. "Celeste," I said sweetly, "would you come with me, please? I have something to show you." She followed me trustingly, her young face bright with innocence. I led her to the old smokehouse behind the main house, a building that hadn't been used in years. Inside, I'd prepared another surprise. "Sit down, child," I instructed, gesturing to a wooden chair I'd placed in the center of the room. Celeste obeyed, confusion clouding her features. "Miss Evelyn, is everything all right? Master Jeremiah, he didn't come to see me last night like he promised." "Oh, my dear," I said, circling her slowly, "Master Jeremiah won't be seeing anyone for quite some time. You see, he's learned a very important lesson about the consequences of breaking vows." I showed her the bloody knife I'd used on Jeremiah, and her face went white with terror. "What did you do?" she whispered. "I gave him exactly what he deserved," I replied. "And now, sweet Celeste, it's your turn." The girl tried to run, but I was ready for that. I'd positioned 2 of my most loyal slaves outside the smokehouse, men who owed their lives to my family and would do anything I asked without question. "You see, Celeste, you've committed a grave sin," I explained as the men held her down. "You've lain with another woman's husband. In the old days, they would have stoned you to death. I'm being merciful." What I did to Celeste was different from Jeremiah's punishment, but no less severe. I wanted to mark her, to ensure that she would never again tempt a married man. The scars I gave her that day would serve as a permanent reminder of the price of adultery. When I was finished, I had Celeste taken to the slave quarters and told the other slaves that she'd been punished for theft. They accepted this explanation without question. After all, slaves were punished for far less every day. Word of Jeremiah's accident spread quickly through the county. Visitors came to pay their respects, bringing flowers and well wishes for his recovery. I played the devoted wife, sitting by his bedside, dabbing his fevered brow with cool cloths. But Jeremiah never spoke of what really happened in that cellar. Whether from shame, fear, or the laudanum I kept him sedated with, he remained silent about his wife's true nature. To the outside world, I was still the perfect Southern belle, gracious and gentle. However, the slaves knew better. They saw the change in me, the way my smile never quite reached my eyes anymore. They noticed how Celeste flinched whenever I entered a room, how she kept her head down and never spoke unless spoken to. Most telling of all, they saw how the other male slaves began to avoid me, crossing to the other side of the path when I walked the grounds. Word had spread through the quarters about what happened to men who crossed Evelyn Beauregard. Within a month, Jeremiah was dead. The doctor said it was infection from his injuries, but I knew better. He'd simply lost the will to live, consumed by shame and the knowledge that his wife had become something monstrous. I mourned publicly, wearing black silk and accepting condolences with appropriate grief. But privately, I felt only satisfaction. Justice had been served, and I discovered something about myself that both thrilled and terrified me. I liked having power over life and death. I liked the fear I saw in people's eyes when they looked at me. Most of all, I liked knowing that no one would ever dare betray me again. The funeral was a grand affair, with half the county in attendance. As they lowered Jeremiah's coffin into the rich Mississippi soil, I stood at the graveside in my widow's weeds, already planning my next move. Because you see, dear listeners, this was only the beginning. The taste of revenge had awakened something dark and hungry inside me, something that demanded to be fed. And in the antebellum South, where power was everything and mercy was weakness, I was about to become the most powerful woman in Mississippi. Tomorrow I'll tell you about my second husband, and how I learned that some men never learn from other men's mistakes. The blood had barely dried on Jeremiah's grave when the suitors came calling. Subscribe now if you want to see how a black widow spins her web. Share this chilling tale, and tell me in the comments which part of this story haunts you most. Because today, we witness Evelyn Beauregard's transformation from grieving widow to calculating predator, and her second marriage will make her first look like child's play. 6 months of mourning was all society demanded, but I gave them 8 for appearances. During that time I ran Beauregard Plantation with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. The cotton yields increased, the slaves worked harder, and my reputation as a shrewd businesswoman grew throughout the Delta. But I was lonely in that big house, surrounded by servants who feared me and neighbors who whispered behind their fans. I needed a husband, not for love, God knows I was done with that foolishness, but for power, protection, and the social standing that only marriage could provide a woman in 1845. The suitors came like vultures to carrion. Word had spread that the beautiful widow Beauregard was not only wealthy, but also available. They brought flowers and poetry, speaking of my tragic loss and their desire to comfort me in my grief. If they only knew what comfort I'd already taken. There was Judge Morrison, a fat man with wandering hands, who spoke of combining our properties. There was Colonel Ashford, a war hero with debts that exceeded his honor. And there was young Timothy Fairfax, barely 25, and clearly after my money rather than my affections. But it was Senator Marcus Blackwood who caught my attention. Marcus was everything Jeremiah hadn't been: sophisticated, educated, politically connected. At 45, he was distinguished rather than decrepit, with silver threading through his dark hair and intelligent gray eyes that seemed to see everything. He owned the largest plantation in 3 counties and had the ear of governors and congressmen. More importantly, he had enemies, powerful men who would love to see him fall. And I had developed quite a talent for making men fall. Our courtship was a careful dance of Southern propriety. He would call on Sunday afternoons, sitting in my parlor while we discussed literature, politics, and the future of the South. He never mentioned my late husband's accident, though I sometimes caught him studying my face as if trying to read secrets written there. "You're not like other women, Evelyn," he said one afternoon as we walked through my rose garden. "There's something formidable about you." I smiled demurely, twirling my parasol. "Why, Senator, whatever do you mean?" "I mean you're intelligent. Dangerous, perhaps. I find that intriguing." The word dangerous sent a thrill through me. Did he suspect? Did he know what I was capable of? Or was he simply drawn to the mystery that surrounded me like expensive perfume? We were married in November of 1845, in a ceremony that surpassed even my first wedding. The governor himself attended, along with senators, judges, and plantation owners from across the South. I wore cream silk instead of white, a widow's prerogative, and carried white roses that matched the coldness in my heart. Marcus moved into Beauregard House, bringing with him his own slaves, his political connections, and his secrets. Because Marcus Blackwood had secrets, dark ones that he thought he'd buried in the Mississippi mud, I discovered the first one within a week of our marriage. I was exploring the rooms Marcus had claimed as his private study when I found the hidden compartment behind his bookshelf. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in a feminine hand and signed, "Your devoted Isabelle." Isabelle Rousseau was the wife of a French diplomat, a woman I'd met at several social functions. She was beautiful in that delicate, ethereal way that men seem to prefer, with pale blonde hair and blue eyes like winter sky. The letters detailed a passionate affair that had been going on for over 2 years. But these weren't just love letters. They contained political information, details about trade agreements and military movements that Isabel was passing to Marcus from her husband's diplomatic correspondence. Marcus wasn't just an adulterer, he was a spy, selling American secrets to foreign interests. I sat in his leather chair reading letter after letter by lamplight and felt that familiar cold rage building in my chest. Here I was again, married to a man who thought he could deceive me, who believed I was too simple and trusting to discover his betrayals. How wrong he was. I began my own investigation using the network of slaves and servants that I'd cultivated over the years. Information flowed through the quarters like water, and I learned things about my new husband that would have shocked even his political enemies. Marcus had debts, enormous ones, to men who collected with violence rather than lawsuits. He'd been embezzling from his own plantation, selling slaves and equipment to pay gambling debts in New Orleans. Worst of all, he'd been planning to use my fortune to cover his losses, then disappear with Isabel to France once he'd bled me dry. But I had advantages that Marcus didn't know about. The slaves trusted me in a way they'd never trust him. They saw me as their protector against his casual cruelty, not knowing that I was far more dangerous than he could ever be. I also had connections of my own now. Jeremiah's death had made me a wealthy woman in my own right, and wealth bought loyalty, silence, and services that couldn't be found in any respectable establishment. I began planning Marcus's downfall with the same careful attention I'd given to Jeremiah's punishment. But this time, I wouldn't act in passion or rage. This would be calculated, methodical, and far more devastating than anything I'd done before. First, I needed to separate him from his allies. I began hosting elaborate dinner parties, inviting Marcus's political friends and their wives. I played the perfect hostess, charming and gracious, while carefully planting seeds of doubt about my husband's loyalty and financial stability. A word here about his gambling debts, a casual mention there about strange visitors to the plantation, a concerned question about his frequent trips to New Orleans, all delivered with such innocent worry that no one suspected manipulation. Meanwhile, I was gathering evidence. I copied his correspondence, documented his financial irregularities, and built a case that would destroy not just Marcus, but everyone connected to him. The slaves helped without knowing it. They reported his movements, his visitors, his private conversations. They brought me letters before he could read them, and carried messages that I'd carefully crafted to further my plans. I also began reaching out to Marcus's enemies, and he had many. Senator Blackwood had made his fortune by stepping on others, and those others were eager for revenge. They just needed someone to show them how to achieve it. That someone was me. By Christmas of 1845, I had everything I needed to destroy Marcus Blackwood. But I wanted more than his ruin. I wanted his suffering. I wanted him to feel the same helplessness and betrayal that I'd felt with Jeremiah. So I waited, playing the loving wife, while I sharpened my knives in the darkness. On New Year's Eve, as 1846 dawned cold and clear over the Mississippi Delta, I made my move. The house was full of guests celebrating the new year. Champagne flowed like water, and everyone was too drunk and merry to notice when I slipped away from the party. I found Marcus in his study, writing another letter to his French whore. He looked up when I entered, his face flushed with wine and guilt. "Evelyn, darling, you should be with our guests." "Should I?" I asked, closing the door behind me and turning the key. "Or should I be here, discussing your correspondence with Madame Rousseau?" The color drained from his face like water from a broken dam. He tried to speak, to deny, to explain, but I held up one of his letters and watched him crumble. "You see, Marcus," I said, moving closer to his desk, "I've learned so much about you these past months. About your debts, your treason, your plans to rob me blind and flee to France. Did you really think I was that naive?" He stood slowly, his hand moving toward the drawer where I knew he kept a pistol. But I was faster, producing my own small derringer from the folds of my dress. "Sit down, husband," I commanded, and the ice in my voice made him obey instantly. "We have so much to discuss, and the night is still young." Outside I could hear the sounds of celebration, laughter, music, the clink of glasses toasting the new year. But in that study, with the lamplight casting long shadows across Marcus's terrified face, I began to weave the web that would trap not just my husband, but half the political establishment of Mississippi. Because you see, dear listeners, I'd learned something important from my first marriage. Revenge was sweet, but power was sweeter. And I was about to become the most powerful woman in the South, one secret at a time. The moon hangs full tonight, just like it did on those cursed evenings when screams echoed across Beauregard Plantation. If you're just joining us, subscribe now and catch up on this terrifying true story. Share this with someone who loves dark history, and comment below if you think you could survive one night on my plantation. Because tonight, we delve into the disappearances that made even hardened overseers cross themselves and pray. By the spring of 1846, I had Senator Marcus Blackwood exactly where I wanted him, trapped in a web of his own making, with me holding every strand. His political career hung by a thread I could cut at any moment, his debts mounted daily, and his French mistress had mysteriously stopped responding to his letters. You see, I'd paid Madame Rousseau a visit during one of my trips to New Orleans, a private conversation between ladies, you might say. She understood quite clearly that her correspondence with my husband needed to end, and that her diplomatic husband might be very interested to learn about her extracurricular activities. But Marcus's downfall was just the beginning of my true education in power. Because running a plantation of this size required more than just fear. It required absolute control over every soul within its boundaries. The slaves had begun to whisper about me in their quarters. They called me the Ice Lady and Death's Bride, crossing themselves when I passed. But whispers could become rebellion, and rebellion could destroy everything I'd built. It was old Samuel, the head groom, who gave me the idea. Samuel had been on the plantation since before I was born, a massive man with hands like tree roots and eyes that had seen too much suffering. He'd watched me grow from a spoiled child into whatever I'd become, and unlike the others, he wasn't afraid of me. He was fascinated. "Miss Evelyn," he said one evening as I walked through the stables, "you got power now, but power without fear ain't nothing but noise." I stopped, studying his weathered face in the lamplight. "What do you mean, Samuel?" "I mean these young bucks, they getting restless. They see you brought down 2 masters and they thinking maybe they can bring down 1 mistress. You need to remind them why that ain't wise." He was right, of course. I'd been so focused on my husband that I'd neglected the more immediate threat. Slaves outnumbered whites 10 to 1 on most plantations, and if they ever truly united, no amount of whips or guns could stop them. But I had something better than whips. I had imagination. The first disappearance happened on a night when the moon was full and the air thick with the promise of rain. Thomas, a field hand who'd been spreading talk about rising up against the devil woman, simply vanished from his cabin. His bunkmates woke to find his bed empty, his few possessions undisturbed. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no indication of where he might have gone. It was as if the earth had simply swallowed him whole. I organized search parties, of course, played the concerned mistress worried about her missing property. We combed the swamps, dragged the river, questioned every slave on the plantation, but Thomas was never found. What the searchers didn't know was that Thomas wasn't missing. He was in the old root cellar where I'd kept Jeremiah, very much alive and learning important lessons about respect and obedience. I'd had the cellar expanded and improved since my first husband's time. Stone walls now extended deeper into the earth, with multiple chambers connected by narrow passages. The air was thick and stifling, lit only by torches that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Thomas hung from chains bolted into the ceiling, his feet barely touching the ground. I'd stripped him naked and left him there for 3 days with only water, letting fear and hunger soften his defiance. When I finally descended to speak with him, he was a broken man. "Please, Miss Evelyn," he whispered, his voice hoarse from screaming. "I ain't done nothing wrong. I got a wife, children." "Oh, Thomas," I said, settling into a chair I'd placed just outside the circle of torchlight. "You've done everything wrong. You've forgotten your place, spread poison among the other slaves, and worst of all, you've shown me disrespect." I let him hang there while I explained exactly what I expected from my property. Absolute obedience, complete silence about plantation business, and most importantly, unwavering loyalty to me personally. "You see, Thomas, I could have you whipped or sold away from your family, but that would be wasteful. Instead, I'm going to give you a choice. You can serve me faithfully, help me maintain order among the slaves, and return to your cabin as if nothing happened. Or I let the word hang in the air like a blade. Or you can join the others who chose poorly. Thomas's eyes widened in terror. Others? What others? I smiled and gestured to the shadows beyond the torchlight. Would you like to meet them? What I showed Thomas that night broke his spirit completely. In the deeper chambers of my underground kingdom, I kept my collection. Men who'd challenged my authority, women who'd spread rumors, children who'd shown too much intelligence or independence. They weren't dead, you understand. Death would have been merciful. Instead, they existed in a twilight state, broken in body and mind, serving as object lessons for anyone who might consider defying me. There was Jacob, who'd tried to run away 3 times. I'd had his Achilles tendons cut, leaving him able to work, but never to run again. He crawled through the tunnels on his hands and knees, tending to the others with the devotion of a broken dog. There was Mary, who'd been caught teaching slave children to read. I'd taken her eyes but left her other senses intact, so she could hear the suffering around her, and know that her defiance had caused it. And there was young Peter, barely 16, who dared to look at me with something other than fear in his eyes. I'd taken that defiance and twisted it into worship, using techniques I'd learned from books in Marcus's library about mesmerism and mental influence. Thomas saw them all, heard their whispered pleas and broken prayers, and understood exactly what awaited him if he chose unwisely. "I'll serve," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'll do whatever you want. Just don't. Please don't." I had him cleaned, fed, and returned to his cabin before dawn. To the other slaves, it appeared that Thomas had simply returned from wherever he'd been. But those who knew him saw the change immediately, the way he flinched when I spoke, the absolute terror in his eyes whenever I was near. More importantly, they saw how he began reporting to me. Conversations he'd overheard, plans being whispered in the quarters, any sign of discontent or rebellion. Thomas became my eyes and ears among the slaves, and his transformation sent a clear message to the others. The disappearances continued throughout that summer. Always on nights when the moon was full, always slaves who'd shown signs of defiance or independence. Some returned changed, like Thomas. Others simply vanished forever, their fate a mystery that grew more terrifying with each telling. I established a pattern, a ritual that the slaves came to dread. On the night before each full moon, I would walk through the quarters, my white dress ghostly in the darkness, selecting my next student. The chosen one would be gone by morning, and their fate would depend entirely on how quickly they learned their lessons. The overseers noticed the change in the slaves' behavior, but attributed it to natural fear of their mistress. They didn't know about the tunnels beneath their feet, the chambers where I conducted my education in obedience. Marcus noticed too, but he was too concerned with his own survival to investigate. His political career was hanging by a thread. His debts were crushing him, and he spent most of his time locked in his study, drinking and writing desperate letters to creditors. He had no idea that his wife was building an empire of fear beneath his very feet, that the woman who shared his bed was becoming something far more dangerous than any politician or general. By autumn, I had complete control over every soul on Beauregard plantation. The slaves worked harder than ever before, not from the whip but from absolute terror of disappointing me. They competed to serve me better, to anticipate my needs, to prove their loyalty, and in my underground kingdom, my collection grew. Each new edition taught the others valuable lessons about the price of defiance, the rewards of obedience, and the absolute power of their mistress. The neighboring plantations began to notice the change. Beauregard's slaves were the most productive, the most obedient, the most valuable in the entire Delta. Other plantation owners came to me for advice, wanting to know my secret. I smiled and told them it was simply a matter of firm but fair discipline, of treating slaves with the respect they deserved as valuable property. They nodded and went away, never suspecting that respect and terror were often the same thing. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, and mine were about to be discovered by someone I never expected. Some houses hold secrets in their walls, but Beauregard Plantation held horrors beneath its floors. If this story has you gripping your seat, hit that subscribe button. Share this nightmare with a friend and tell me in the comments if you've ever felt evil watching you from the shadows. Because tonight, someone finally discovers what lurks beneath the beautiful facade of the South's most terrifying mistress. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, arrived at Beauregard Plantation on a crisp October morning in 1846, carrying his medical bag and a letter of introduction from the governor himself. He was a man of science, educated at Harvard, and trained in the latest medical techniques, sent to investigate reports of unusual illnesses among the slave populations of Mississippi. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his days. Dr. Hartwell was not like the local physicians who asked no questions and accepted whatever explanations plantation owners provided. He was young, idealistic, and believed that medicine should serve all of humanity, regardless of color or station. I received him in my parlor, dressed in a gown of deep blue silk that complemented my pale complexion. Marcus was away in Jackson, trying desperately to salvage his political career, so I was free to handle this unexpected visitor myself. "Dr. Hartwell," I said, offering him tea with my most gracious smile. "How wonderful to have such a distinguished physician visit our humble plantation. Though I must say our slaves are remarkably healthy. We pride ourselves on their care." He was handsome in that earnest, scholarly way that some women found attractive. Dark hair, intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and hands that looked more suited to books than the brutal realities of plantation life. "I'm sure you do, Mrs. Blackwood," he replied, accepting the delicate china cup. "However, I've received reports of some unusual symptoms among slaves in this region. Unexplained injuries, sudden personality changes, and a disturbing number of disappearances." I sipped my tea calmly, though inside I felt the familiar cold calculation taking hold. How curious, I haven't noticed anything unusual. But then again, I leave the day-to-day management of the slaves to my overseers. Perhaps you'd like to speak with them. Actually, I'd prefer to examine the slaves directly, if you don't mind. Sometimes the most telling symptoms are the ones that overseers might overlook or misinterpret. There was something in his tone that suggested he suspected more than he was saying. I studied his face over my teacup, noting the way his eyes never quite met mine, the slight tension in his shoulders that spoke of a man prepared for unpleasant discoveries. "Of course," I agreed, "though I do hope you'll join us for dinner tonight. It's so rare to have such stimulating company." I assigned him to the guest room in the East Wing, far from the main house and even farther from the hidden entrance to my underground chambers. Then I sent word to my most trusted slaves, those who'd learned their lessons well, to spread the word that the doctor was not to be trusted, that he was there to cause trouble for everyone. Dr. Hartwell spent the afternoon in the slave quarters, examining men, women, and children with a thoroughness that impressed even me. He was gentle with them, speaking in soft tones and treating them with a respect that clearly confused many of the slaves. But I watched from a distance, and I saw what he saw. Thomas, my first convert, flinched violently whenever anyone approached from behind. His hands shook constantly, and he kept glancing toward the main house as if expecting some terrible punishment. Sarah, one of my more recent students, had developed a stutter that made her nearly incomprehensible. She'd been perfectly articulate before her time in the cellars, but fear had stolen her voice. And then there was little Moses, only 12 years old, who'd shown too much curiosity about reading and writing. I'd been gentler with him than the adults, but the child now moved like an old man, his eyes vacant and staring. Dr. Hartwell noticed all of this, I could tell. He made careful notes in his leather journal, asked probing questions, and grew more troubled with each examination. That evening at dinner he was quiet and thoughtful. I'd prepared his favorite dishes, I'd made inquiries about his preferences, and opened a bottle of my finest wine. The dining room glowed with candlelight, and I'd worn my most becoming gown, a creation of emerald silk that made my eyes look like jewels. "You seem troubled, Doctor," I observed as we finished the main course. "I do hope our slaves haven't disappointed you with their health." He set down his wineglass and looked at me directly for the first time. "Mrs. Blackwood, I've seen things today that concern me greatly. Injuries that don't match the explanations given, psychological trauma that suggests systematic abuse, and a level of fear that goes far beyond normal discipline." I smiled serenely. "My dear doctor, I'm afraid you may be misunderstanding the nature of slave management. These people require firm guidance, and sometimes that guidance must be memorable." "Memorable." His voice carried a sharp edge. "Mrs. Blackwood, I've examined slaves who show signs of deliberate torture, healed wounds that could only have been inflicted by someone with medical knowledge, psychological conditioning that speaks of prolonged, systematic terror. The accusation hung in the air between us, like smoke from a funeral pyre. I continued eating calmly, cutting my meat with precise, delicate movements. "Dr. Hartwell," I said finally, "I think you may have spent too much time in the North. Here in Mississippi, we understand that slaves are valuable property that must be protected and controlled. Sometimes that control requires methods that might seem harsh to outsiders." "This isn't control, Mrs. Blackwood. This is sadism." The word hit me like a physical blow, not because it was untrue, but because it was so perfectly, precisely accurate. I felt something dark and pleased unfurl in my chest, a pride in being so clearly seen and understood. "Such strong words, Doctor. I do hope you won't let your northern sensibilities cloud your medical judgment." But Dr. Hartwell wasn't finished. After dinner, he excused himself early, claiming fatigue from his journey. I watched him go, noting the determined set of his shoulders, the way his hand unconsciously checked the pocket where he kept his journal. He was planning something. I could feel it in the way predators sense the approach of hunters. That night, I waited in my room until the house was quiet, then made my way through the hidden passages that connected the main house to my underground kingdom. I needed to check on my collection, to ensure that everything was secure should Dr. Hartwell prove more curious than was healthy for him. But when I reached the main chamber, I found it empty. Not abandoned. My students were still there, cowering in their corners and chains, but there was someone else present, someone who didn't belong in my carefully controlled world. Dr. Hartwell stood in the center of the chamber, his face pale with horror in the torchlight. His medical bag lay open beside him, instruments scattered across the stone floor where he'd dropped them in shock. He'd found the hidden entrance behind the wine cellar, followed the passages down into the earth, and discovered the truth about Beauregard Plantation. "Dear God," he whispered, staring at the broken souls that surrounded him. "What have you done?" I stepped out of the shadows, my white nightgown making me look like a ghost in the flickering light. "I've created order, Doctor. Perfect, absolute order." He spun to face me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disgust. "You're insane. This is monstrous." "Is it?" I moved closer, noting how he backed away instinctively. "These people are fed, sheltered, and cared for. They have purpose, structure, and the security of knowing exactly what's expected of them. Isn't that what civilization is supposed to provide?" "This isn't civilization, this is hell," I laughed, the sound echoing off the stone walls like the cry of some night bird. "Hell, Doctor? No, this is education. These people have learned valuable lessons about respect, obedience, and the consequences of defiance. They're better for it." Dr. Hartwell looked around the chamber again, taking in the chains, the instruments, the broken bodies and spirits of my collection. When he looked back at me, there was something new in his eyes, not just horror, but understanding. "You enjoy this," he said quietly. "This isn't about control or discipline. You enjoy their suffering." "I enjoy their improvement," I corrected. "I enjoy seeing chaos transformed into order, rebellion transformed into obedience." "Is that so different from what you do, Doctor? Don't you take satisfaction in healing the sick, in imposing health upon disease?" "That's completely different." "Is it? We both reshape human beings according to our vision of what they should be. The only difference is that my methods are more honest." He was backing toward the entrance now, his hand fumbling for the passage that led back to the surface. But I'd had the foresight to position some of my most loyal students along that route. "I'm going to report this," he said, his voice shaking with rage and fear. "The governor will hear about this. The whole world will know what you are." "Will they?" I asked, genuinely curious. "And who do you think they'll believe, Doctor? A respected plantation owner, a pillar of Mississippi society, or a northern agitator with wild stories about underground chambers and tortured slaves?" The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. In the antebellum South, my word carried the weight of law, while his accusations would be dismissed as abolitionist propaganda. But Dr. Hartwell was more resourceful than I'd given him credit for. Instead of trying to flee, he reached into his medical bag and pulled out a small camera, one of those new daguerreotype devices that could capture images on metal plates. "Then I'll show them," he said, raising the camera toward my collection. That's when I knew Dr. Hartwell would have to join my students permanently, because some secrets are too dangerous to let walk free, and some witnesses are too credible to let live. The flash of the camera lit up the chamber like lightning, capturing forever the truth about what lay beneath Beauregard Plantation. But it would be the last photograph Dr. Edmund Hartwell ever took. The night when hell came to Beauregard Plantation started like any other, but ended with flames that could be seen from 3 counties away. If you've been following this nightmare, make sure you're subscribed, because tonight we witness the moment when even the most broken souls find the courage to fight back. Share this with someone who needs to hear about the power of human resilience, and comment below if you think evil ever truly gets what it deserves. Dr. Hartwell's disappearance caused quite a stir in Jackson. A Harvard-educated physician sent by the governor himself, simply vanishing from a respectable plantation, was the kind of scandal that demanded investigation. But I was ready for the investigators when they came. Sheriff Morrison arrived 3 days later with 2 deputies and a federal marshal, all looking very serious and official. I received them in my parlor, dressed in mourning black. I'd recently received word of a distant cousin's death, how convenient, and played the role of concerned hostess to perfection. "Gentlemen," I said, offering them refreshments, "I'm simply devastated by Dr. Hartwell's disappearance. He seemed like such a dedicated young man." "When did you last see him, Mrs. Blackwood?" the marshal asked, declining my offer of bourbon with a curt shake of his head. "At dinner 3 nights ago. He mentioned feeling unwell and retired early. When he didn't appear for breakfast, I assumed he'd left early to continue his rounds. It wasn't until his driver came looking for him that I realized something was amiss. It was a perfect lie, supported by my household staff who'd been well trained in the importance of protecting their mistress's reputation. The driver confirmed that Dr. Hartwell had planned to visit 3 other plantations, and searches of those properties turned up nothing. What the investigators didn't know was that Dr. Hartwell was still on my property, in the deepest chamber of my underground kingdom. He'd joined my collection as its most distinguished member, though his Harvard education hadn't prepared him for the lessons I taught. The daguerreotype plates he'd exposed were safely hidden in my private safe, along with his journal and any other evidence of his discoveries. To the world above, Dr. Edmund Hartwell had simply vanished into the Mississippi wilderness, another victim of the dangerous frontier. But his disappearance had consequences I hadn't anticipated. Word spread through the slave networks that connected plantations across the Delta. Slaves had their own communication systems, invisible to white eyes but more efficient than any telegraph. They knew that Dr. Hartwell had been asking questions, examining their people, treating them with unusual kindness. And they knew he'd vanished after visiting Beauregard Plantation. The first sign of trouble came from an unexpected source, Marcus himself. My husband had returned from Jackson a broken man, his political career in ruins, and his debts finally catching up with him. He'd taken to drinking heavily and wandering the plantation at odd hours, muttering to himself about betrayal and revenge. It was during one of these drunken wanderings that he stumbled upon something he shouldn't have seen. I was conducting a lesson in the underground chambers, teaching a new student about the importance of absolute obedience, when I heard footsteps in the passage above. Heavy, unsteady footsteps that could only belong to my intoxicated husband. Marcus had found the hidden entrance. I heard him stumbling down the stone steps, cursing the darkness and calling my name. By the time he reached the main chamber, I was waiting for him, still wearing my teaching clothes, a leather apron over my white dress, stained with the evidence of my educational methods. "Evelyn," he slurred, squinting in the torchlight. "What in God's name? Where are we?" He looked around the chamber, taking in the chains, the instruments, the cowering figures of my collection. His alcohol-fogged mind struggled to process what he was seeing. "This is my classroom, Marcus," I said calmly, "where I teach important lessons about respect and obedience." The truth hit him like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his face going white with horror and understanding. You're insane. These people are my property, just as you are my husband, and like you, they needed to learn their proper place." Marcus tried to run then, stumbling back toward the passage that led to the surface, but he was drunk, disoriented, and I was prepared. My most loyal students blocked his path, their eyes empty of everything except the need to please their mistress. You can't do this to me," Marcus gasped, backing against the stone wall. "I'm a United States Senator." "You're a failed politician with crushing debts and a taste for French whores," I corrected. and you're about to become my most important student." What followed was Marcus's education in humility, a process that took several days and left him fundamentally changed. When I finally allowed him to return to the surface, he was a different man, quiet, obedient, and absolutely terrified of his wife. But Marcus's disappearance into my underground world had been noticed by the house slaves, and word of it spread through the quarters like wildfire. The slaves began to understand that no one was safe from their mistress's attention, that even the master himself could vanish into the darkness beneath their feet. Fear turned to desperation, and desperation bred something I hadn't expected: courage. It started with whispered conversations in the dead of night, slaves gathering in hidden corners to share their terror and their growing resolve. They spoke of Dr. Hartwell, of the master's strange behavior, of friends and family members who'd vanished on full moon nights. They spoke of escape, of rebellion, of burning the whole cursed plantation to the ground. The leader of this growing resistance was someone I'd underestimated. Old Samuel, the head groom who'd once advised me about the nature of power. He'd watched me transform from a spoiled girl into a monster, and he'd finally decided that some monsters needed to be stopped. Samuel had advantages that I hadn't considered. He was trusted by slaves throughout the region, he knew every inch of the plantation, and most importantly, he understood that I was no longer entirely human. "She got the devil in her," he told the gathered slaves one night in the old tobacco barn, "and the devil got to be cast out." The plan they hatched was simple but effective. On the night of the next full moon, when I would be conducting my usual selection and education, they would strike simultaneously at multiple points. Some would set fires in the cotton fields and outbuildings, creating chaos and drawing attention away from the main house. Others would block the roads to prevent escape or the arrival of help from neighboring plantations, and a select group led by Samuel himself would storm the house and find the entrance to my underground kingdom. They'd been watching, learning my patterns, noting which slaves disappeared and when. They knew about the hidden passages, the chambers beneath the house, and they were prepared to face whatever horrors they might find there. What they weren't prepared for was how thoroughly I'd broken some of their own people. The night of the rebellion, I was in my chambers with a new student, a young woman named Grace, who'd been caught trying to teach her children to read. She hung from the ceiling chains, her lesson in the dangers of education just beginning, when the first flames appeared in the cotton fields. I saw them through the small window that provided ventilation to the chamber, orange tongues of fire licking at the night sky. My first thought was accident, a carelessly tended fire perhaps, or lightning from the storm clouds gathering overhead. But then I heard the shouting, the sound of running feet, and I knew this was something else entirely. "It seems we have visitors, Grace," I said calmly, setting down my instruments. "Don't worry, dear. We'll continue your education shortly." I made my way through the passages to the main chamber, where my collection waited in their usual positions. But something was different. There was tension in the air, a sense of anticipation that I'd never felt before. "Thomas," I called to my first convert, "what do you hear above us?" He listened for a moment, his head tilted like a dog's. "Trouble, Miss Evelyn. Sounds like the slaves is rising up." I felt a thrill of excitement rather than fear. A rebellion. How delicious. I'd always wondered what would happen if my property tried to assert themselves against their betters. Now I would find out. But as the sounds of chaos grew louder above us, I began to realize that this wasn't the disorganized uprising I'd expected. The fires were too coordinated, the shouting too purposeful. Someone was leading this rebellion, someone who understood strategy and timing. The first of them found the entrance within an hour. I heard them in the wine cellar above, moving furniture, searching for the hidden door that led to my kingdom. They were methodical, thorough, and they knew exactly what they were looking for. When the door finally opened and torchlight spilled down the stone steps, I was ready for them. I stood in the center of my main chamber, surrounded by my collection, wearing my finest white dress and holding a pistol in each hand. If I was going to face my rebellious property, I would do it with dignity and style. Samuel was the first to descend, his massive frame filling the narrow passage. Behind him came a dozen other slaves, men and women I recognized, people who'd worked my fields and served in my house for years. They stopped when they saw me, their torches casting wild shadows on the stone walls. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke. We simply stared at each other across the chamber, the mistress and her property, the teacher and her unwilling students. "Samuel," I said finally, my voice echoing in the stone space. "How good of you to visit my classroom. I've been expecting you." His eyes moved around the chamber, taking in the chains, the instruments, the broken souls that comprised my collection. When he looked back at me, there was something in his expression I'd never seen before. Not fear, not hatred, but pity. "Miss Evelyn," he said quietly, "what did you become?" "I became what I needed to become," I replied. "I became powerful." "You became sick," he corrected. "Sick in your soul. And now you made this whole place sick too." The other slaves were spreading out around the chamber, surrounding me and my collection. I noticed that some of my students were looking at the newcomers with something like hope in their eyes, and I felt a flash of anger at their disloyalty. "You forget yourself, Samuel," I said, raising one of my pistols. "You forget who owns you, who feeds you, who gives your miserable life meaning." "Nobody owns me," he replied, taking a step closer. "Nobody owns any of us. We've just been too scared to remember that." That's when the shooting started. I fired both pistols simultaneously, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Samuel staggered, but didn't fall. My aim had been hurried, and the bullets had only grazed him. The other slaves rushed forward, and suddenly the chamber was filled with struggling bodies, shouts, and the clash of improvised weapons against stone. Some of my collection tried to defend me. The conditioning ran deep, and fear was a powerful motivator. But others turned against me, their broken spirits suddenly finding strength in the presence of their rescuers. The battle was brief, but vicious. I fought like a cornered animal, using every weapon at my disposal. Knives, chains, even my bare hands and teeth. But I was outnumbered, and my opponents were fighting for their freedom, their lives, their very souls. When it was over, I lay bleeding on the stone floor of my own chamber, my white dress stained red, my carefully constructed kingdom in ruins around me. Samuel stood over me, his own wounds bleeding freely, holding one of my own knives at my throat. "It's over, Miss Evelyn," he said quietly. "Your teaching days is done." Above us I could hear the plantation burning. The flames had spread from the cotton fields to the outbuildings, and now they were consuming the main house itself. Smoke was beginning to seep down into the chambers, carrying with it the smell of my burning empire. "You think this changes anything?" I gasped, tasting blood. "You think burning down one plantation will end what I've started? There are others like me, Samuel, others who understand that power is the only truth that matters." "Maybe," he admitted, "but they ain't here tonight. Tonight it's just you and us, and justice finally coming home." The slaves freed their imprisoned brothers and sisters, carrying those too broken to walk, supporting those whose spirits had been shattered by my education. They moved with purpose and compassion, showing more humanity in those moments than I'd displayed in years. As they prepared to leave my burning kingdom, Samuel looked back at me one last time. "We ain't gonna kill you, Miss Evelyn," he said. "That would make us like you, but we ain't gonna save you neither. You can burn with your house, or you can find your own way out. Either way, your time as our mistress is over." And then they were gone, leaving me alone in my collapsing underground world, with the flames growing closer and the smoke growing thicker with each passing moment. The flames that consumed Beauregard Plantation could be seen from Natchez, painting the Mississippi sky blood red on that cursed night in 1846. If you followed this nightmare to its end, subscribe now, because some stories never truly end. They just wait in the shadows for someone brave enough to tell them. Share this final chapter with those who need to know that evil always faces judgment, and comment below if you believe some spirits are too wicked to ever find peace. The smoke was choking me, filling my lungs with the bitter taste of my burning empire. Above, I could hear the roar of flames consuming everything I'd built, everything I'd controlled. The beautiful Greek revival mansion, the cotton fields, the slave quarters, all of it turning to ash and memory. But I wasn't ready to die. Not yet. I dragged myself across the stone floor of my chamber, my white dress now torn and stained with blood and soot. The knife wound in my side burned like fire, but I'd survived worse. I'd survived 2 husbands, countless enemies, and the judgment of a society that never understood what I truly was. The hidden passages that had served me so well now became my salvation. While the main entrance filled with smoke and debris from the collapsing house above, I crawled through the narrow tunnels that led to the old root cellar, the place where my education in power had first begun. The cellar had a separate entrance, concealed beneath the ruins of an old smokehouse that the flames hadn't yet reached. I emerged into the night like some creature born from hell itself, gasping and bleeding but alive. The plantation was an inferno. The main house stood like a skeleton against the night sky, its windows glowing like the eyes of a demon. The slave quarters were empty. My property had fled into the swamps and forests, carrying their wounded and their stories of what they'd found beneath their mistress's feet. I could hear horses in the distance, the sound of riders approaching from neighboring plantations. The fire would have been visible for miles and help would be coming soon, but what would they find? A tragic accident, a slave rebellion, or something far more sinister. I had to disappear before they arrived. I made my way to the old carriage house, the same building where I'd first discovered Jeremiah's betrayal so many years ago. Hidden beneath the floorboards was an emergency cache I'd prepared long ago, gold coins, jewelry, and papers that would allow me to assume a new identity if necessary. As I gathered my resources, I caught sight of myself in a broken mirror propped against the wall. The reflection that stared back was barely recognizable as the beautiful Southern belle who'd once charmed senators and governors. My face was streaked with soot and blood, my hair wild and singed, my eyes holding a madness that even I found disturbing. But I was alive, and as long as I lived, I could rebuild, could start again somewhere else. The sound of approaching horses grew louder. I had minutes, perhaps less, before the first rescuers arrived. I gathered what I could carry and slipped out into the night, heading for the river where I kept a small boat hidden among the cypress trees. Behind me, Beauregard Plantation continued to burn, the flames reaching toward heaven like the prayers of the damned. I spent 3 days hiding in the swamps, living like an animal while I planned my next move. The mosquitoes feasted on my blood, the humidity made my wounds fester, and the sounds of the bayou at night reminded me constantly that I was no longer the predator in this wilderness. On the 4th day, I made my way to a small town downriver, where I used my hidden gold to buy passage on a steamboat heading south. I told the captain that I was a widow fleeing the violence that had consumed my plantation, and he accepted my story without question. New Orleans welcomed me with its usual indifference to the past. In that city of sin and secrets, a woman with gold and no questions asked could disappear completely. I rented a small house in the French Quarter and began the process of becoming someone new. But the past has a way of following us. No matter how far we run, the stories began almost immediately. Travelers from Mississippi brought tales of the mysterious fire at Beauregard Plantation, of the slaves who'd vanished into the night, of the underground chambers discovered in the ruins. The authorities had found my kingdom, you see, once the flames died down and the debris was cleared away. They found the chains, the instruments, the evidence of what I'd done to my property. They found bones in the deepest chambers, remains of those who'd failed their final examinations. And they found Marcus, my second husband, chained to a wall and driven completely mad by his education in humility. The newspapers called it the most horrific discovery in the history of Mississippi. Editorials demanded justice. Rewards were offered for information about the missing mistress, and my name became synonymous with evil throughout the South. But I was beyond their reach now, hidden in the shadows of New Orleans, planning my return to power. I spent months studying the city, learning its rhythms and secrets. New Orleans was different from rural Mississippi, more cosmopolitan, more tolerant of eccentricity, but also more dangerous. Here, power came not from owning land and slaves, but from controlling information, vice, and the darker appetites of civilized society. I began small, using my remaining gold to purchase a boarding house in a respectable part of the quarter. I presented myself as Mrs. Evangeline Rousseau, a widow from Mobile who'd lost everything in a fire. The irony of using my former rival's surname wasn't lost on me. The boarding house became my new laboratory. I selected my tenants carefully, young women from good families who'd fallen on hard times, men with secrets they'd pay to keep hidden, travelers who wouldn't be missed if they disappeared. I was more subtle this time, more careful. Instead of underground chambers, I used locked rooms and soundproof walls. Instead of chains and instruments, I employed laudanum and psychological manipulation. I'd learned from my mistakes at Beauregard, and my new methods were far more sophisticated. But New Orleans had its own predators, and they recognized me for what I was. It was Madame Laveau who finally confronted me, the legendary voodoo queen whose power in the city rivaled that of any politician or businessman. She appeared at my boarding house one evening in late 1847, her dark eyes seeing straight through my carefully constructed facade. "I know what you are," she said simply, settling into my parlor as if she owned it. "I know what you did up in Mississippi, and I know what you're planning to do here." I tried to maintain my innocent widow act, but Madame Laveau just laughed. "Child, I've been dealing with evil longer than you've been alive. You got the stink of it on you like perfume. Question is, what we gonna do about it?" What followed was a negotiation between two women who understood power in all its forms. Madame Laveau offered me a choice: leave New Orleans immediately and never return, or face the consequences of challenging someone whose power was older and deeper than anything I'd ever imagined. I chose to stay. It was a mistake that would cost me everything. The war between us was fought in shadows and whispers, with weapons that left no physical wounds, but destroyed souls just as effectively. Madame Laveau turned my own tenants against me, filled my boarding house with spirits that drove away customers, and slowly strangled my new empire before it could take root. But her greatest weapon was the truth. She spread the story of Evelyn Beauregard throughout New Orleans, ensuring that everyone knew exactly who Mrs. Evangeline Rousseau really was. The respectable facade I'd built crumbled like ash in the wind. By the spring of 1848, I was finished in New Orleans. My money was gone, my reputation destroyed, and my enemies closing in from all sides. I had one final choice to make: surrender to justice or disappear forever into the wilderness that had spawned me. I chose the swamps. On a night when the moon was dark and the mist rose from the bayous like the breath of ghosts, I walked into the Louisiana wetlands and vanished from the civilized world. Some say I died there, consumed by the alligators and snakes that ruled that watery wilderness. Others claim I found a way to survive, living like a wild thing among the cypress trees and Spanish moss. But the slaves who escaped from Beauregard Plantation, the ones who survived to tell their stories, they knew the truth. They said that on nights when the moon is full and the mist rises from the water, you can still see her walking through the swamps. A woman in a white dress, her eyes like winter ice, searching for new students to teach her lessons of pain and power. They say she's still out there, somewhere in the dark places where civilization fears to tread, still teaching, still punishing, still believing that power is the only truth that matters. And maybe they're right. Maybe some evil is too pure, too perfect in its malevolence to ever truly die. Maybe it just waits in the shadows, patient as death itself, for the right moment to emerge and begin its education all over again. The plantation house is gone now, burned to its foundations and reclaimed by the Mississippi earth. But sometimes, on nights when the wind is right and the moon is full, people say they can still hear screaming coming from beneath the ground where Beauregard Plantation once stood. They say it's just the wind, or animals in the forest, or the settling of old foundations, but the descendants of those who survived my lessons know better. They know that some screams echo through eternity, and some teachers never stop teaching, even after their classrooms have turned to dust. My name was Evelyn Beauregard, and I was the most feared woman in Mississippi. I taught lessons that no one could forget, built an empire on fear and pain, and discovered that power is indeed the only truth that matters. And if you're listening to this story on a night when the moon is full and the shadows seem to move on their own, remember this: evil never truly dies. It just waits for someone foolish enough to think they can control it, someone arrogant enough to believe they can teach it new tricks. Because in the end, we all become students in the classroom of darkness. And some teachers are far more patient than others.